So we decided to like go with the rolling starts because it's kind of like just a more casual thing. At the first, like, I don't know how many episodes it was, Ethan, 2, 3, maybe. I was like, welcome to the modern Meathead experience. I don't know. And then I was like, oh, this is stupid. This is just something I'm doing because everyone else is doing it. So, but I also realized by like giving a preface to the fact that this is a more casual intro, it's kind of a way to formalize what would otherwise be casual. But anyway, just kind of rolling right into things. For those of you that don't know Hector, which is likely a majority of people, Hector, I mean, there are some trainers at the gym will know
Maybe.
your name. Yeah, you're well known around the hype parts in the personal training scene. But Hector has been a good friend of ours, and Hector is also a personal trainer, much like some of the other people that have been on. Hector's been a trainer for what over a decade for sure, I think.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
So
11 years
just
now.
damn, okay, yeah, that's like how old I am. So you've been doing this a long time, and we're thanks for coming on. We love these kinds of chats, and Ethan and I are both looking forward to this. So just in terms of like an introduction, people know kind of where you're coming from, just in terms of like what sorts of
Yep.
makes what kind of things make you want to just talk to us, and what are you interested in today, and what kind of things are we going to be sort of talking about here?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I was born and raised in NYC. Went to school here, went to college here. Uh, uh, Dove into fitness when I was around, I want to say like 16, 17. Actually, it was my dad who kind of like forced me into the gym. Like, get over here, we're gonna get you into the weight room. And he kind of like guided me through, a basic routines like, hey, we're gonna have a chest day, a back day, leg day, those kind of splits. But it kind of helped because he really emphasized like I want to say structure and like form and tempo, like so it kind of gave me a good baseline. I want to say going further into it. And then from there, I always played sports growing up, so I was always into just like physical movement activity. Um, and then yeah, I kept training on my own and started like training several friends of mine, and then it became like, hey, why don't you start training people like on a more professional level? And so I thought about it, and then I started educating myself a little more into like how do you train human beings, not just like, hey, sit down and do like a bench press or a bicep curl. And then from there, I started working at a commercial gym, and I did that for about 5 years. And it taught me like just the business aspect and how to socialize with human beings where you have nothing in common with. So that really helped. And from there, I, got a good grasp of the game and decided like to take things on my own, start my own business, and move over to hype. And that's what led me to you fellas here. Ethan was probably one of the first people I met at hype. Yeah, time goes by. It's been a long time, Ethan. Been a long time.
It has.
Uh,
And I
yeah.
can't help but think as I listen to you, and I know this story already, so my mind is drifting off to other places. And when I listen to podcasts, and that there, Ben, you were talking about like not doing a formal intro and like not really like doing the typical things that people like promote on a podcast. And I've often I don't know like really know where to find these things, but apparently you can like share, subscribe, like do all the social stuff. I think if that's a thing, if this is on YouTube and people can press buttons and like and comment and do that sort of stuff, I would like to see a poll on like best haircut of the podcast, like Ben versus who's looking pretty smooth here. I know a lot of your fans, Ben, think that you're really like the top of the mountain for that
Yeah,
sort of thing, but
yeah.
we're tapping into a different demographic here. Maybe
I,
the
Yeah.
Latin
I,
American population.
well, yeah, Ethan, don't count yourself out, man. You know, I mean, I think you got a solid haircut. Sometimes it gets a little
Yeah.
bit unwieldy. To be honest, though, not the best hair day for me. I was wearing a hat all morning, so especially most people, I'm assuming, are going to listen to audio. It's like matter anyway, but I'll put a polo. Okay.
I mean,
and
I
we'll
really,
review.
really just derailed everything that Hector was saying, but like I had to
Yeah, totally.
get that out there,
Totally.
give you a little break, get settled in here. But do continue.
Yeah. So yeah, that's what led me to hype. And I'm ready to go into these questions. That was just a brief summary of what I had, not to like bore anyone with my personal career. Um, are you guys ready for these questions I have for you guys?
Born ready.
Oh yeah.
Born ready. All right. So a thing that I see like going around social media now are like, good exercises, bad exercises. And although like they say like, no exercise is bad, but I want to say for specific reasons, maybe one might be better than the other. So when like, you know, I and I say this, I could be speaking for others, uh, slightly for myself as well. But going into like when we're speaking about hypertrophy, right? We hear a big thing of like, the convergence at the top of the movement that you're looking for, of where you want to catch like the main contraction
Like in a press.
of the exercise.
Like in a
Yeah, let's just
press.
go with a yeah.
Sure.
For example, let's go with a press, right? So we'll say like a chest press. Like what's the significance of an exercise that converges versus one that doesn't, right? And like what's the like the factor that it'll have in the exercise, right? Versus it like you're not having that kind of converge at the top versus one that does.
Hmm. Yeah. So I think this, um, I think a really good place to start with this and a more general point, I think it's important to talk about just whether or not it's specific to the converging press or the converging diverging row, whichever way you think about it. And for those people that don't know what converging means, it's basically just like if you were to sit down on, like a cable chest press, theoretically what you could do is you could bring your hands together, or you could, sort of keep your hands more parallel to each other. Converging just means sort of coming together into more adduction. So some machines are built that way. Some machines are not. Some machines are more linear. So I think the easiest two things to kind of picture would be like one, like a bench press that's kind of like just loaded in a more linear way. And then two would maybe be like a converging, machine press, like the prime press is a good example. The Nautilus Nitro. There are a ton of other examples, but a converging press is one that comes together at the top. So again, so to kind of start the conversation, I think it's very, very helpful to understand exercise through the lens of the human body separate to specific implements, right? Because when we think about exercise, what we do is we give exercise labels, and we give those labels specific names, and we say this is this one thing in this category over here, and then there's this other thing over here, when in reality, although we label things differently for the convenience of sort of just having a sort of common starting point. Like if I say deadlift, people intuitively know what a deadlift is. But then if you tell 10 people to do a deadlift, you would probably get 10 different things that look a specific way, right? You wouldn't get 10 identical things that are deadlift, right? And I think everyone knows that intuitively, like on some like just general feel level. But then when we actually start to break exercises apart, people start to think that it doesn't really matter, like, an exercise is an exercise. So when we say converging press and when we say non-converging press, what we're like, the difference between those two things is not necessarily, to some degree it'll be the joint motion, because it could be the difference between ending up here in a press versus like slightly apart. But ultimately, in any press, your arms are converging, right? You just have to take the whole pressing conversation away, just the label of press. You have to take it out of your head. Were you gonna say something to me?
Yeah, can you just explain that to people? Like, I know what you mean. I can picture it in
Yeah.
my head, but I don't think the average person listening is going to automatically intuit what you say when you say converging. Like they're looking at the hands, maybe.
Sure,
And
sure,
like,
sure.
I
Yeah.
don't see that happening, but you're looking somewhere else. So
Yeah.
maybe just give a little context to that, and keep in mind probably a lot of people are listening audio.
Yeah. Great, great,
Yeah.
great interruption there. So I would say that, like, the way that I would think about something that is converging or diverging, which would really be the opposite, is when you're talking about, we'll just use the specific example of a press. Okay, everyone can kind of picture a barbell bench press, right? Everyone naturally, whether they're trained or they're not trained, they end up in a position where, like, when they unrack the bar and their arms are locked, their wrists are usually stacked directly on top of their elbows, and their elbows are usually stacked directly on top of their shoulders. So everyone can kind of picture that. It would be, the same position as in like the top of a push-up, right? So you unrack the bar and your arms are at a specific point. And when you lower the bar down, right, you have to lower the bar down in such a way that your arms are moving away from your body, right? But because the elbow is moving and the elbow is bending along with the arm moving downward, it's a little bit tricky to sort of isolate like what part of the body we're talking about. So when we're talking about a press or a pull, we're talking about the upper arm bone, right? So basically, like, the bone on top of which your biceps and your triceps sit, right? That humerus bone, that is the specific motion. That specific bone is the one that we're referring to when we're talking about in a press, say, using words like converging or diverging as we would in a row. So again, at the top of the bench press, what we're really looking at is, like, yeah, we're looking at motion of the forearm and motion of the elbow sort of bending, but what is moving away from the middle of your body, we'll say just the sternum as a reference point, what is moving away from your body is the upper portion of the arm. So if you're looking on video, it's, easy to see. It's like the space basically between the elbow and the shoulder joints. That's the bone that we're looking at. So if you were to make a comparison to other exercises, we would say, oh, a fly is really different than a press, right? Because a fly sort of looks like this, where the entire arm is straight all the way down to my hand. But a press in reality is the exact same motion of this upper half of the arm. It's just that the elbow is moving, right? So visually speaking, a press looks very different than a fly is. And in a few nuanced ways it is, especially because of loading directions and changing stuff. But fundamentally, what we're talking about is basically just the fly type motion that you can do with your arm. And all we're adding in on top of that is people bending their elbow. So does that make sense, Hector? Because you're seeing it and you're hearing it. Okay.
Absolutely.
Ethan, where do you think that?
I think the idea of just like cut everything from the elbow on up off, like in your visualization, like visualize a bench press, like the bar's floating in space. You have no hand, you have no forearm, and just imagine what's happening from the shoulder to the elbow. And you'll see that the arms come towards the body, towards the midline of the body, just like they would in a fly. So if you had, nothing from the elbow on down to the fingertips in the fly or the bench press, and you just, erased in the video the barbell, you erased in the video, the cable or the dumbbell, you erased in the video the hand, the forearm, you would see the same motion about the shoulder joint, or in this case, the humerus bone, the upper arm bone. You wouldn't be able to tell the difference in that motion for the most part.
Yeah, that's a really good way to think about it.
Is that track, Hector?
Definitely. Wait, so you're saying, when looking at the pressing motion that converges, right? That's what obviously as we were talking about. You're saying those two meeting is what you're looking at in order for you to like see that it's actually getting what you want out of that press, or converging at the top, right? So you're saying from the shoulder to the elbow. Is that can you like simplify this even more, like for just like a normal gym goer, right? That's just trying to
take your fist, like make a fist, and I can't do this. Maybe you guys can. Like, try to touch your shoulder with your fist, right? Maybe extend your thumb, right? And then imagine you're doing a bench press. Like, what would your arms do? Like, if you just keep your your fist at your shoulder the whole time, like, how would you bench from there? Your arms would come forward, and as they come forward, they would come together, right?
Yeah.
And then do the same thing, but now do a fly. So again, bring your thumb to your shoulder and imagine you're doing a fly. No, Don't move your hand though. So keep your thumb at like on your shoulder the whole time. There you go.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what
Okay.
you'll find is those are exactly the same motion. If you just keep your fist, or your thumb like on your shoulder the whole time, don't let it leave, and just imagine in your mind's eye that you're doing a press or a fly, and you'll notice, oh, the same thing is happening at the shoulder. So, people think about a bench press and they're like, I know that, the chest does these things. It's like it does, adduction. So like they immediately think of a fly and they're like, where's the adduction like in a press? Like, I don't think most people see that, right? But when you just think about it from that joint, like from that bone, it's much easier to see versus the like, the average person off the street might think, oh, chest, like it moves my arm out, and it's like, no, you're not seeing that your arm bones are actually moving, inwards. That's harder to see than just the bar is moving away from you.
Right.
So I think, definitely I can remember like getting into lifting, being like somewhat confused about that. Like, okay, I see this like pressing motion. Where's the adduction?
Adduction. Same.
Yeah. So that's a really good way that was, because I haven't thought to really even describe it that way. So I guess the easiest way to take this conversation now, slightly more specifics from, again, we're separating motion of the body from exercise. And the reason we do that is because we need to be able to just see actually on the body what's moving, to this whole conversation around, okay, this humerus bone is technically creating this same sort of motion, but just, the position of the elbow is really the only difference. So like Ethan said, if you cut everything off from, below the biceps and triceps down, the motion of the arm would look exactly the same. So whether it's a pec fly or whether it's a bench press, motion of the humerus is very similar, right? So motion from here up, generally speaking, very similar, obviously different constraints, right? So then what is the difference? The difference is the direction specifically of what the load is trying to do to you, right? So in a bench press, the bar just wants to crush you, right? And in a fly, if you're using a machine, the load kind of arcs in a semicircle, much like it would on a leg extension or a leg curl or something that is a little bit, like a preacher curl, right? Basically just something that moves like a machine in sort of the way that your joint moves, right? So when you get down on a leg extension, hopefully you're able to set up such that the arm and the pad basically that's on your shin can just move exactly like your shin wants to move, and it's not rolling upward or downward. And the same holds true for a fly type motion. So the other thing that I wanted to say in regards to that is, if you understand the framework then of like, okay, the difference really between a fly and a press is just motion of the elbow, right? Then you also can kind of take the next step and say, okay, well, when we talk about like a converging press, we really just mean a press that is loaded in a direction that is more specific to the way that the arm bone wants to pivot. Okay, so if you think about like this, and as I go through these, I want to make sure that like you're with me at every step, because then if we get to the end and then there was a step missing, it's going to be super confusing. So if on one side of the spectrum you have a loading, we'll call it direction, that's linear, meaning like front to back, i.e. the bench press, right? That's sort of one end of the spectrum. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have a machine fly. Okay. So a machine fly, the cool thing about a machine fly is that the direction that the handle is pushing against you is changing at every single inch of the range, right? Because when your arms are all the way back here, and for the listeners, it's like at the stretch position of a fly. When your arms are back here, the handles are pushing you directly backward, right? But then when you come all the way forward to the full contraction, you're squeezing your pecs and your hands are together. Now the handles are pushing me outward, right? Because if it were still pushing me backward, the handles would just fall directly on my face. So the cool thing about the fly is that the direction that it's resisting you, in a machine fly at least, is changing at every single point throughout the range. The bench press is the total opposite, because the bench press, again, grabbing a bar or dumbbells, whatever it is, they're just trying to fall directly on you in a sort of linear type of way. Now, a converging press is sort of the third variation that you have, which is it's not linear in the sense of it's not just trying to fall on you one direction, but it's also not changing its direction at every point in the range. It's kind of in between. Okay, so think about like a cable converging press, right? We do those all the time, right? Like at the gym. And for those of you who don't know what a cable converging press is, it's basically just a cable press where the cables are set up not as wide as you might put them with a fly, but also not directly behind you, right? Such that they mimic the loading of like a dumbbell press or something like that, but just sort of somewhat behind you and slightly outward, so that when you press, it's kind of like the cables are like coming to a triangle and they're sort of coming in and out along with you. So if on one end of the spectrum, you have the linear loading of the bench press, on another, you have the arcing motion of the fly, which changes constantly. The converging press, I kind of view as like something that's in the middle, where again, the motion of the arms can technically be largely the same, but the loading, instead of being like this, front to backward on a bench press, is just slightly outward. And so what that does, so are you with me so far there, Hector?
Yep.
Okay. And Ethan, is there anything that would be you stand out as totally confusing? Okay. So if we're looking at a converging press that way, we can say more generally that the difference in a converging press, although to some degree it could be like, your arm path goes slightly more in and it goes slightly more out, right? As compared to like a regular press or a fly or whatever. What we're really talking about when we say converging press is we're talking about the load direction specifically, right? So it's not this like mystical far out thing that's like totally distinct from a bench press and totally distinct from a fly. It's kind of like a blend of those things where, because it's a blend of those things, and now maybe this is to the larger point of like, or to the other portion of the question, which is like, what is really the benefit of the converging press is, well, I think to really understand that, we should talk just a second about like where a bench press is limited in terms of, we'll just say if the goal is to develop my chest. Yep.
Just before we go into the benefits, right?
Yeah.
Would you say then basically the press that converges, they just kind of more meeting at the top and at the middle?
Yeah.
Right? Whether it's a chest press or kind of some kind of vertical press. If you want to say it like layman's terms, would you agree to that?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay,
So as you press, and it's really, I would say, specific to the implement rather than the person. Like it ends up being about the person, right? Like that's how we can describe it. We can say, oh, in a converging press, my hands, come more inward, but my hands only come inward because the load is moving inward and outward. It's very obvious to see on like a machine where the handles start out wider toward your shoulders, and then as you press, the handles come closer together. But it's less obvious on something like, a cable, right? Where it's like you're kind of just looking at this thing that's pulling in the same direction the whole time. Okay. So, yeah.
I mean, this may just be like slight layer of confusion, but I think like some context here would also be like, again, with the loading direction, if you think about like a dumbbell versus a barbell, you could still see that same convergence with the dumbbell. So you'd still have that appearance of like, oh, my hands are coming together, but that's not the same then as the loading profile of a machine fly, and not even the same profile as a converging machine, because the dumbbell always wants to fall straight down. So I think it's important to point out sometimes where it's like, yeah, it is true that your hands will be coming together and that is converging. But really the point, the major point here is the loading direction. And, Ben's probably really struggling not to use the word like tangential, but that most accurately describes, how this thing is being loaded along the path. So if you can picture, that dumbbell press, right, Hector, it really, has that, it is converging, and it really has that same appearance as like a converging machine. But it cannot mimic the same loading direction that a machine can. Is that something you can visualize?
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point to add that in there. Yeah, for sure.
And this is kind of what I was going to say with the benefits thing, but I think it makes sense to put it in here, which is that the main reason I see a converging press to be so useful, especially if you can get on a machine that like fits you really well. And again, when I say converging press, like we know we're not just talking about the motion of the arms, we're talking about the arm motion with the load direction stuff, is the benefit of the converging press is it kind of combines the benefits of a fly and a traditional linear press, right? Because the limitation of a fly is you don't really have a ton of loading in the stretch position, right? But when you get to the end of the fly, you're like, fuck, that squeeze. Most of the loading, most of the difficulty ends up being about the shortest, most contracted, we'll call it, position. But the opposite is true in like a dumbbell press, where it's like you get to the top of a dumbbell press, you can kind of just hang out there. Right? It's like there's some load on like the shoulder girdle, but you can kind of just hang at the top of a dumbbell press where the pec is in a shorter position. What are you gonna add?
Yeah. So then, would you say a chest press motion that converges at the top, uh, the the heaviest part is going to be in that short position, right? It's always going to be in the short position, never the lengthened position.
So I would say there's a distinction. Like if you were in a dope converging chest press machine, what the chest press machine would be organized to do is it would be organized in such a way where it felt like the whole and the entirety of the range was loaded really well, which would just mean basically that the machine in terms of like a resistance profile would be heavier, where you're in the stretch position, and it would get lighter as you kind of squeeze forward, right? Just because of how piss weak you are in that short position. I would say that, but that's not a lot of converging chest press machines. So what usually ends up happening is, you're right, is people end up getting to that lock position of a converging chest press, and they're like, holy shit, the fully short position is like really, really hard. And then they can usually bang out, at least most people, not Ethan tends to be a little different, but you can usually bang out like another 4 to 6 reps, like in that more lengthened position. Just because the shorter position tends to be harder, but it's not necessarily because it's really just due, in my opinion, to a mismatch of how the machine is acting on you versus your strength level. So an example would be like most leg extensions that you get on will be really hard at the top, right? And much easier at the bottom, and you can usually bang out partials at the bottom. A really good adjustable leg extension you could make so that it was really hard at the bottom and lighter at the top. So what it would appear to look like is it would appear as if you have kind of like an even amount of strength throughout the range. You're kind of just grinding throughout the range. There's exercises that you get into, like maybe it's a machine and you just feel like you can just grind the rep and it just like still can slowly move. That's usually an example of a machine that has what you would call a match profile, meaning basically just wherever you're weak, it's not acting on you as heavy. And wherever you're strong, it's acting more on you, so the amount that you can lift is appropriate to what the machine is providing. But most converging chest presses they don't get easy enough toward the lock. So the lock ends up being still the hardest part, much like it would be in something like a fly, right? But it obviously depends on the converging chest press machine. If you were doing this with cables, which I know you do, you almost 100% of the time are going to fail first in the shortest position, right? You're not going to finish a whole rep and then get to the bottom and like not be able to move out of the bottom. That's a very rare case that happens with like a cable chest press. Most people end up being able to do a ton of partials if they're training, to the end of that shortened range. Does that answer that?
So like a few things. One of the most probably common places where people are going to do a converging press is on hammer strength machines. Hammer strength incline, chest press, really.
Yep.
Hammer strength machines are set up to be heaviest in the short position, pretty much across the board. So that's a place where people might get that impression of, wow, like when my arms come together, that's, where it's heaviest. Or when I do a fly in a really wide, cables with really wide cable stacks, like it's really heavy, like in that short position. But it really is a distinct thing in terms of where something's difficult. So it happens that, like Ben was saying, many machines happen to be heavy there and they also happen to be converging, but it's not a function of the fact that they're converging. So that's really important to keep in mind, is like, we've discussed several distinct things. We've discussed completely separately an arm path, right? So if I'm on this video and I'm sitting in a chair and I bring, my arms together like I'm doing, a dumbbell press, a fly, a barbell press again, without the implement in my hand, you don't really know exactly what I'm doing. But the issue is sitting in this chair, the resistance is actually down towards the floor because it's gravity, right? So you could imagine me sitting in this chair and you could say, oh, Ethan's, moving his moving his arms towards the screen right now. I can tell that's a bench press. But if I had a barbell in my hand, that's not a bench press. That's kind of, that's almost like a front raise in terms of the loading profile, right? If I just held my arms out there, if I was bench pressing and my arms were towards the screen right now and I was on my back, I'd be doing no work. But if I was holding 225 out towards the screen, now, my front delts are doing a ridiculous amount of work. So we have the anatomy, we have the arm path, right? But that doesn't tell us about what muscles are being trained, where it's difficult. Yeah. So that was like the initial thing Ben was talking about, is recognize that the arm path on a lot of these motions are pretty close. The second thing that we started talking about was loading direction. So that's what I brought up in relation to me sitting in this chair and reaching towards the screen. Is you might recognize that as a seated chest press, but if there's not a cable coming from behind me or a machine that's resisting me, opposite to the direction I'm, reaching towards the screen, it's not that at all. It's, it's another exercise entirely. So the second part there is the loading direction, and that changes everything. And then what we were just discussing is, credit to Tom Purvis with the idea of, with the naming and just further interpretation of these things we call resistance profiles. That's, an entirely different topic, because you could take those initial two things that we talked about, and in an instance where we were using the same device, let's call it a cable, those things might influence the profile in terms of the way my arm's moving, the way we set it up, where in terms of where we set it up, where's the cable coming from? You've seen before, Hector, you could set up on an incline on the cable and you could say, I'm doing an incline chest press. But if the cables are coming from literally just going through your chest at an angle that they would be normally on a bench press, they're sort of going just horizontally through the the middle of your chest, right through your sternum, versus kind of more vertically, say through where your front delt would be, you're still just doing a horizontal chest press even though you're on an inclined bench. So you have the anatomically the direction that you're moving. You have the loading direction, and now you have the profile, which on a dumbbell, a cable, it might already be predetermined by the previous two things. But what we're talking about now is machines, but you can design a machine to be hard, wherever you want it to be hard, regardless of the previous two things. So it's important to make that distinction, that the previous two things don't dictate the profile. The person who designs the machine ultimately dictates the profile. But you might associate those two things because more often than not, the people who design the machines may design them to be similar to something you're used to. Typically if you go in a gym, and I was just in the gym yesterday with probably 100, definitely more than 100 pieces of equipment. And regardless of how many pieces of equipment were in there, everyone just uses the same things they always use. There were some of the most incredible pieces that I've never seen before. And I wasn't even training. I just walked around for an hour and a half like a kid in the candy store and just had an amazing time, by myself, just getting on equipment. And it was easy because no one was on any of the equipment I was trying to get on. Everyone was on the hammer strength stuff and the stuff that you've seen a million times before, right? And the funny thing is, if you got on a piece of equipment that actually had a really great profile, it would be so different from what you're used to. You probably wouldn't like it. It's much like the Kaiser, right? That's what makes the Kaiser hard to sell. Is they're like, this thing sucks. It doesn't feel anything like a normal leg extension. It's like, yeah, that's the point, but people really aren't ready for that. So I think more often than not, people just go with that which they're used to, and oftentimes that's actually not a great profile. And at the end of the day, equipment companies have to make money, so a lot of those same trends just kind of get perpetuated over time.
Heck, what were you gonna say?
Yeah, Ethan, I keep hearing you speak about resistance profile, right? Could you briefly describe what does that mean, resistance profile?
Ask a Ben.
You say
That's what
fast
Ben.
Ben?
I just feel like this is like shtick.
Um,
Not
That's
specifically.
fast to you, Ben.
yeah. I'll receive it. So when we think of resistance profile and the word resistance, like when we're referring to resistance, we're referring to like external implement that's acting on us. So dumbbell, barbell, cable, whatever. And when we say resistance profile, what we're really looking at is we can think about it as the amount of force on us at every point in a range of motion. So a resistance profile is really specific to whatever external implement that we're using, again, be it a machine, barbell, dumbbell, and it's specifically determined. People usually divide exercises up into like different portions of a range. So we typically say like long and short, or if we're referring to a bench press, we say the bottom and the top. So using the example of a bench press, what we would say to describe the resistance profile of a bench press, assuming just normal controlled circumstances, is that the profile is such that the weight is harder for us to lift in the bottom as it is at the top. But that gets confusing because a lot of people are like, well, wait, like isn't like a lot of times don't people just struggle with lockout, and like isn't lockout the hard part and people can kind of get a little bit out of the bottom? That's when it starts to get confusing. Resistance profile really just refers to how much the external implement is acting on us, okay, which has nothing to do directly with like where in the exercise that you're going to fail. So in like a very simple way, I would think about a resistance profile as where is the exercise mechanically hardest. I usually use the word mechanically hardest because I don't mean to describe when exactly in the range that you're failing, because when you talk about where in the range you're coming to a failure point, you have to look at other things like what is the technique that the person is using, in terms of things like arm path and tempo and those kinds of things, but also like in terms of length tension relationships and how strong is the muscle in this position and how strong is it in this position. So resistance profile is distinct from what other people commonly refer to as like strength profile. Strength profile is essentially that, but inside of you. Okay, so every muscle has a strength profile, which basically describes, okay, if a muscle is in X position, it's this strong. And if a muscle is in Y position, it's this strong. So we can say in the lengthened position of the pecs are much stronger. And in the shortened position of the pecs are much weaker. So the strength profile of your pecs, in terms of just referring to that specific muscle group, is such that when they're more lengthened, they're stronger, and when they're more shortened, they're weaker. Right. So that strength profile is sort of specific to you, specific to a muscle. Resistance profile is specific to machine, dumbbell, barbell, and both of those things just describe really the effectiveness of the force against you or that you are producing. Another word for that would be torque. If you've ever heard the word torque, torque is basically like a force's effectiveness.
Yeah.
Okay, so the word profile to me is just like, can you vaguely describe where you are strong or weak, or where the exercise that you're doing is hard or easy? So the resistance profile again of the bench press is generally it's harder at the bottom, easier at the top. And the resistance profile of a standing dumbbell curl is such that it's easier at the bottom, harder at the top, right? So I think it's easiest and most practical to define it in like hard, easy terms, But then when you're referring to
Got
strength
it.
profile, you're referring to your specific strength. And both of those things are separate entities, which can get confusing when they start to overlap. Because when they overlap is really like what you see in terms of what an exercise looks like when someone is failing on an exercise, if that makes sense.
Take some examples here. I think the most common example and the one that you kind of just immediately tend to resonate with is like a dumbbell lateral raise, where it's like, imagine, holding a 30-pound dumbbell with your arms, up, abducted, right? Like you lift your arms away from your sides and you hold those 30-pound dumbbells there. And I say, Hector, would you rather hold, if I put, 20 seconds on the clock, would you rather hold those dumbbells, up by your shoulders away from your body, or would you rather hold them at your side? And intuitively you would know it's much easier to hold them at your side, or even if I said like, all right, I want you to do 10 reps, you can either go from your arms halfway lifted to, all the way away from your body, or you can go from your side to halfway lifted. So it's like dumbbell lateral raise. Would you rather do the bottom half or the top half? Like where could you do more reps?
The bottom.
Yeah. So you would say intuitively like, right, I can do more reps at the bottom than I could do at the top. And that's one way to look at, sort of the combination of those two things. Like the result of the, what's going on internally and what's going on externally is what you experience. So at the end of all this, you experience, well, I could do a hell of a lot more reps at the bottom than I could at the top. And that's where like cheating comes into play. The notion of cheating is you're avoiding the hardest part. So similar on the squat, if I said, Hector, would you rather do 10 reps, at the bottom of the squat or 10 reps at the top of the squat if you had to move, the most weight? So you would probably say, I'd rather do the top half of the squat. Those are, when people say partial squats, they're talking about going down halfway. They're not talking about going down all the way and then coming up halfway. So those are two examples where you're like, yeah, I think it would be a lot easier to just do the bottom half of the lateral raise and the top half of the squat. And that's kind of the end product of all this, is just like, where do I experience this thing, as most difficult? And one way to think about that would just be like, where could I do the most reps? And again, that's the combination, much like we were talking about before. There's, we're at least three parts, most broadly to the first subject we were talking about. And in this subject of just like, where do we fail? Where is something hard? There's the two parts, like our abilities, in terms of the, internal physics, and then what's acting on us externally. So we call the internal part the strength profile, and the external part the resistance profile. Again, a la Tom Purvis with that whole thing. So the resistance profile on a machine tends to be largely determined by that often like circular, oval shaped, nautilus is, named after like, the seashell kind of shape that they have, to their cam, the thing that the cable runs around, that ultimately is one of the factors that determines, where in the arc of a machine something is difficult. Versus like with, free weights, it's really just like what is the distance, away from, whatever joint, that we're training, right? So as you move like that dumbbell away from your body, it's getting, further and further away from you. Specifically in this case, we're talking about like at the shoulder. And that determines like how difficult it is for you to do that. Those are some just like, kind of visceral examples there. Is that like as a concept, as far as like, okay, I can picture where those things are difficult. Do any more questions kind of come off of that concept in and of itself?
No. Now I'm just trying to piece the question together, because we talked about like the loading direction, right? And now we're going into the resistance profile.
Yeah. Right? So let's use an example of like putting that all together. and
Yeah.
we'll kind of switch in between, say, like a dumbbell and a cable, right? Because we were talking about pressing to begin with. So let's take like a dumbbell fly and a cable fly, and we can determine like where we set that cable, but ultimately they're going to be they're usually going to be pretty different. So if you're doing a dumbbell fly, Hector, like, would you rather do, with the same amount of weight, do you think you could get more reps doing the very top or the very bottom?
The top.
Yeah, the top, right? So the top of that
Mm-hmm.
part is going to be the easiest.
Mm-hmm.
But if we were to set up cables where it tends to be where the cable stacks are, kind of far apart from each other. And, when your hands come together at the top, if the cables aren't just like running along your arm, if the cable is,
Yeah.
moving, let's say, 90 degrees or close to 90 degrees away from, where you're holding on,
Yeah.
you can tell there's still some work there. There's still some work where like you can't just rest. Like at the top of the dumbbell fly, you could literally just rest there like you could, a press, dumbbell, barbell, whatever.
Absolutely.
But with the cable fly, it's like, well, what do people like about that? They're like, I get to squeeze, like, I can really like, get a good pump, train those inner fibers or whatever people say, right? You can get a really good squeeze. And it's like, well, why can you get a squeeze with the cable, but not a squeeze with the dumbbell? And the reason is the direction of the resistance, right? And in this case, that also plays into the profile. So when you said I'd rather do, I could get more reps at the top of the dumbbell fly, the profile is such that it's very hard at the bottom and it gets easier, as you go up. Whereas, with the cable, there's still going to be resistance at the bottom, and depending on how you set it up, it could be less or more in comparison at the top. But there's pretty much always going to be some resistance at the top part too. So just on a relative basis, if nothing else, the top of the cable fly is going to be harder than the top of the dumbbell fly because of the direction of resistance, and then as a consequence of that, the profile is also going to be such that it's relatively harder, short with your arms together in comparison, to the dumbbell fly.
Yeah, and just to add in the because I want to circle this back to the converging chest press. When I mentioned earlier that the converging press is sort of akin to like a combination of, a bench press type loading or a dumbbell type press loading and a fly together, is because it loads you backward, but it also loads you outward, right? And a lot of times if you're doing a cable fly, and it's really what we're calling hard in terms of resistance profile in the squeezed position, a lot of times it loads you more outward than backward, right? So the advantage of a press just overall is that it loads your arms moving backward, right? So you can load the stretch the most. And the advantage of the fly is that you can load the shortest position, which is kind of opposite to that. But the advantage of the converging press is you combine the good things about both of those two, and you sort of smush them into one exercise, right? So if you were setting this up in like a cable converging press, and you set it up in a way where, the cables basically, in terms of, if you drew a straight line from where the cable is coming from to the handle, as imagine it kind of like a triangle, right? You're pressing inward. And if generally speaking, if people can just get a mental image of this, I think it would be helpful. So if you were doing a cable press and you were like sitting on a bench and the cable was kind of like in line with your forearm, and as it went back, it was, you could imagine that straight line sort of continuing. If you came from like this wider position and the quote bottom of the press, the stretch position, to that, short position where your hands are now close together, those cables would basically stay in a straight line, right? It's not like the cables would be moving like this a ton, or at least hopefully they wouldn't be. So what that really means in terms of like what the load is doing is, again, it's pulling you backward, but there's an element of it that's kind of pulling you in that outward direction. So it just means a more complete loading of the entire range of the press, right? Because The advantage of the dumbbell press is that it loads you a lot at the bottom. The disadvantage is that it doesn't load you a lot at the top. The advantage of the fly is that it loads you a lot in the short position, the squeeze, but it doesn't load you a lot, at least compared to a press, in the stretch position. So the converging press is super useful because it's a combination of those two things. And in addition to loading more of the total range, because you're loading the stretch position and the short position now a ton, your brain, in terms of like the what people are calling like the neuromechanical matching, which is like a really obnoxious fancy way to just say like what your brain sort of picks in terms of muscle recruitment, your brain will go much more towards pecs than it will anything else in that circumstance, because of how much more specific the loading is to the function of the pec. Right. Because in the example of the fly, you have other helpers, right? You have potentially biceps doing some stuff. You have this coracobrachialis guy that wants to help you adduct. In a bench press, for example, your triceps are able to help you a ton because of the fact that you can create like a frictional force on the bar that basically helps you sort of, move the bar upward. Right. But in a converging press, imagine like, in a converging press, if you were sort of getting to the short position where you were start to struggle, if your triceps, and this will be easier for people to see than to hear, but if your triceps were to contract too hard in a cable converging press, the cable would just go outward, right? There would be no like fixed thing for your triceps to shove out into. Like there would be in a barbell press, because in a barbell press, again, you have that sort of constraint to keep your hands in place. But because you're able to move your hands around, if your triceps contribute too much, or if your delts contribute too much, right, your hands get pulled in a different direction than you're trying to move. So what I would say is, in addition to the greater percentage of the total range being loaded, you have a greater specificity of that loading. So the converging press is good in that it combines those loading parameters and it sort of makes up for the differences between the two in some ways. But it's also much more specific of a motion, in that even if you wanted someone to try to cheat the motion by recruiting some other, unrelated tissue, they have a much more difficult time doing that. And so in my book, like these kinds of motions, the ones that are more specific, are also more easy to teach, generally speaking. And the reason I think that's the case is if you have someone who's never done a converging press before, they're going to find it very weird and uncomfortable, because they're like, why can't my brain just sort of reorganize around this thing? And the reason is because, unlike, in the bench press, or a leg press is a really good example of this. Like in a leg press, when you start to get to failure, no matter what, if just assuming like a normal leg press that's like 45-degree angle, right? Just your average leg press. Once you start to get to, closer to failure, your brain can start to do different things because your foot is fixed somewhere. Right. So in that case, like you could recruit more quad, toward the end of a set. If you were struggling with your hips, you could recruit more hips if you were struggling, to maintain output in your quads. But again, in this specific example, at least, cheating and kind of moving farther away from the mark that you're trying to hit becomes progressively more difficult. So your brain just doesn't have the options that it might in another scenario. So those are the big upsides to me, I would say. And just a kind of final comment on that is, I would also say that a lot of people, I think, lean away from doing something like a cable converging press because, and this is to Ethan's point earlier, it's usually a very unfamiliar thing to them, both in terms of the sensation and the experience of not being able to cheat, but also in that you actually have to be much more precise, again, in this cable example, than you might be if you were to just go on and just grab a barbell or grab dumbbells. Like you have to be more specific about where you're going to angle the cables relative to the bench, how you're going to be able to get in and out of the exercise, the position of the cable and how that might change throughout the range of the exercise, and whether or not that's good or bad relative to your goal and all those kinds of things. So with greater precision comes a greater ability to fuck it up, but that's just kind of like the flip side of the same coin.
So I think with this type of stuff, a lot of people just come back to like, well, bro, I just want to get jacked. Like, which one should I do? Yeah. And, just kind of bringing it home to that. I mean, where my brain goes, like Ben was saying, it just comes down to specificity. So it's kind of the classic, like grenade versus sniper rifle type of thing. Like if, I've never hunted before, but like I can see deer, walking outside right now. Like if I had a pistol or like a grenade, and you're like, all right, you just get like one shot here to like kill this deer. Like I'm gonna probably be more accurate with the grenade,
Yeah.
than the
Fucked
pistol.
up.
I have
Just fucking hope. Just hope for the best.
with the grenade. It's only like probably 15 yards from me right now. So the premise there is like, if you only had like, one exercise to train all of your pressing, muscles. We want to get some delts, we want to get some triceps, we want to get, some pecs, and we want to just do it in like a one shot scenario with as little thought to programming as possible. Minimal like prior injuries or contraindications. Like that's at least in my mind, not speaking for Ben, that's often where this idea of like, all right, beginners, just like go and bench press, that's gonna just like, least amount of thought, like that's just gonna hit the most things. And I think, there's some validity to that argument. Like even when doing that, based on your limb lengths, based on your execution, like the thought that you're just gonna hit everything equally is also not true. It may be a terrible exercise for one person's pack. Like it might barely be like a good stimulus over time for a certain person's anatomy and a certain person's execution. But if you just had to like, throw your money down on the table and say like, which one is going to, give me the best chance of hitting, all the pressing shit at once, like it's probably going to be your barbell bench press. But in reality, or dumbbell or whatever, like in reality, that isn't how most people train. So with a little bit more thought, you could break things up a little bit more and split it into multiple exercises. So you have that choice always based on asking like, what are my limitations? Like what equipment do I have available to me? Like what, prior injuries do I have? Like how much, time do I want to spend in the gym? Even that one you could find your way around. But a lot of it is just kind of like, how much energy do I want to put into like, putting together a well-constructed program. And, if all I need to do is just pull this pin and like, Nadia, I could close my eyes and I could definitely hit this deer. Like, yeah, just go for it. But then also you're probably not listening, to this podcast. So not saying that one is better than the other. Like there's definitely a time and place for like specificity, which is, a different conversation in and of itself. But I think that's the core principle is just like with a more specific motion, loading direction, resistance profile, all those things we talked about, you have greater and greater specificity. And with greater specificity comes greater responsibility, right, Hector?
Wow.
Absolutely. And with tying all of that in, would you say from an orthopedic standpoint as well, like being more specific to your training, being more mindful of the exercises you choose, loading direction, resistance profile, etc. Like long-term effects, right? So yes, you said in the beginning, if I want to just go train, several muscles at once, yeah, I could barbell bench press or dumbbell bench press or whatever it is. But if I want to get more specific, uh, and have longevity, right? Then this kind of direction might be it for everyone if you're trying to be here in the long game.
If you get it right, you know, that would be my take on it. Like, yes, I think with anything, if you are more specific in the right direction, you get a more
Yeah.
sustainable, more accurate, more reliable result. You can also be specific in the wrong direction, though. You can be wrong. But I think the journey is always like with more knowledge creates, greater clarity in terms of like where you're, applying your attention to and what the effects of that are. So like if you're on the search, if you're on this path of, greater and greater mastery, that always leads to greater specificity. And that always just gives you the option to do that when you want. And it might not always be the best solution, to the problem that you're solving, but there's no reason not to have that tool in your pocket, because it will come up for you or a client, or a situation at some point where the right tool for the job is greater specificity. So I don't think in theory, yes, it's always better to have more of that as an option, in my opinion. Whether or not it's the right option to solve whatever problem you have in front of you, is what you learn, with greater and greater mastery, is not only what your options are, but when and where to apply, those options. If I get really, really good with a pistol, then I won't blow up my whole porch and my couch, and I don't have to pick up all those pieces. So with killing this deer that I can no longer eat because it's got all the shrapnel, and everything in it, and I just blew a hole in my wall. I created a lot of problems, and I got very little meat out of this solution. Whereas the pistol takes more time, it takes more precision. But if I can wield it and use it well, then it's going to cause less potential issues. But if I can't, then I just don't shoot the deer. So that's also a problem, right? I also want, if the goal is to get the deer and you can't shoot a pistol, that's also an issue too. So I think that's important to keep in mind, that day one, if you got one bullet and you have to hit that thing, you have to be, I think it's valiant to go and practice, and it's valiant to go and learn. But just the notion that if I'm more specific, if I have a tool, I should use it, doesn't mean it's necessarily the right tool for you at that point in time. And I think with greater and greater mastery, you learn, what the right tool is at the right time.
Yeah, I've been a member at a particular local gym for over 10 years, and I'm not there as much as I used to be. And I know everyone there pretty much. And like I said, it's been over 10 years. And throughout the years, I literally see most of those individuals just break down, right? From just continuing to do the same shit. Overhead pressing, barbell overhead pressing, bench pressing with the barbell, and just the technique isn't the greatest. And just throughout the years, I just literally see them just break down, break down, break down. So I'm just pretty sure there's more individuals in pain lifting than not. So, I do feel the option of going the route, more with more precision is a better outcome for the longevity of your body and training,
Yeah, I think to just kind of add to or maybe to translate some of the analogy, I think that Ethan's really has this out for, this deer analogy. We're just going to keep rolling with it. But to translate it in a little bit of a practical way for people, I think that if you are able to successfully be more precise, and being more precise, by the way, doesn't have to be, because I think people's minds, at least in my audience, goes straight to oh, are you doing, this exercise for the short position of the short head of the biceps? And it's we're not necessarily talking that level of specificity. Not that I think that's necessarily irrelevant, but in terms of what we're talking about, the way that I look at it is, if you have two options, and one option is you do 4 sets of barbell bench press, and the other option is you split that into 2 exercises, so maybe one is more pec delt and the other is more triceps. That's probably the outcome, that you're looking for with choosing a bench press. You don't have to do as much, at least in my estimation. You probably, if you do 4 sets of bench, again, depending on someone's anatomy, that could look like 3 sets of tricep and maybe, equate to 1 set of pecs, or 4 sets of pecs and 0 triceps somehow, right? Just depending on the person. So not only could you be potentially more calculated in like where you're allocating volume specifically, but you could also be, I think, more aware of exactly how many hard sets you're doing for every single muscle group. And as a product of that, how many hard sets you're doing for specific joint forces, right? So there's the kind of like two specific pains that people get very broadly. It's like, there's the immediate pain where I do this thing and immediately it's like, fuck, this thing hurts. I pick up a bar and I do a skull crusher and my elbow feels like it's going to explode. Or it's like the sort of slow burn, like putting something in a boiling pot of water, where it's like maybe it doesn't hurt today or tomorrow or next week, but over the course of X amount of weeks, it's like I get to week 12 of my block, week 10, and it just feels like this joint is going to just walking around makes it feel like it's going to fall apart. So there's the slow burn and there's the acute thing. And I think that the slower burn type of poor outcome often comes about from just like a mismanagement of where you're allocating stress, which is why I think it's useful to be able to be more precise when you can and more specific when you can, because at least in my experience, what ends up happening is you end up being able to more intelligently distribute stress slightly differently while maintaining the same or potentially better outcomes, right? Because there are plenty of people who just, if 4 sets of bench isn't sufficient, they'll do fucking 20 if they have to. But rather than doing that, I find that it's, we'll say more intelligent to try to be more specific if you can, for the volume allocation reason, and then as a consequence, the orthopedic health reason, if that kind of makes sense.
Absolutely.
And not that it's necessarily the case that we can be like, one set of cable converging press equals X amount of sets of bench press, but I think we can be reasonably confident with a kind of theoretical explanation and an understanding that, okay, at least with this converging thing, I know that I'm getting some unit of stress in this particular tissue. Whereas with the alternative option, it may be like, this thing is pumped as shit, but like so is my triceps, and like my neck kind of hurts. So like maybe that's a set for neck, so that's typically where I tend to lean. And when you can teach people kind of how to do that for themselves, I find that it's a world of difference for people. If not, again, in terms of outcome, I think people can end up in very similar places. Just kind of how people feel when they get there, for sure.
Yeah, definitely agree. Go ahead, finish.
Well, I was just going to ask anything if you had any sort of follow up to that.
Could we tackle one more question here?
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. So the next question I have probably a little, I guess, could be controversial, I want to say, but it's under the realm of PEDs, right? Performance enhancement drugs. Oops. But there's a bunch of ways that people take it. It could be irresponsible. It could be just really like a gym bro kind of thing. Like, hey, I take this, I recommend this, and just give you just random dosage that you should take, not knowing like anything about you. So to be more specific, I'm going to give you just like a hypothetical situation, and maybe you could give like some kind of a legitimate answer to like how you would guide this person. So the question I have is a male that's from the range of 25 to 35 years old, has been training anywhere from 5 to 10 years, checks off all of the checks off any clearance boxes, so his health is kind of in, for the most part, in good shape. Um, Tracks his food, wants to put on muscle. Where should they start? Like, where would you find like a good baseline for a person who wants to start that?
I'm assuming this question is directed towards Ben primarily.
Absolutely not, buddy.
You know me.
So, one of the things about kind of like, you know, getting into what seems like a very different subject, like we just, you know, went entirely, you know, off before, is we think that like the principles change, right? But they really don't. Like we were just talking about this concept of like specificity, and you know, with greater and greater mastery comes the ability to not only understand what the tools do, but when they're applicable. And it's the same thing here. Is like when you're coming into it, you know, as a novice, you see like um, you sort of see everything undifferentiated in terms of like understanding what, you know, when we say PEDs, you know, performance enhancing drugs, everyone thinks, you know, steroids, and that's like the breadth of the umbrella here. But you know, the deeper you get into it, the more you realize, wow, PEDs ranges from, you know, NSAIDs, you know, for like pain management, right, to you know, stimulants, which were some of the earliest PEDs, really. Like those were some of the first performance enhancing drugs, like in the modern world, you know, specifically like in cycling, like amphetamines. You know, from what I understand, the most like commonly failed drug tests are for beta blockers, you know, in like shooting sports, for example, like in the Olympics. So this would be like the opposite of an amphetamine, you know, or a stimulant that, you know, the beta blocker is going to bring down your heart rate, and it may allow you to, you know, be able to focus a little bit better in terms of like steadying yourself, you know, with a shot. So the first thing people think of with performance enhancing drugs is, you know, big bodybuilders, strong powerlifters, that sort of stuff. But it's important to realize just the entirety of the breadth of this conversation, and that, you know, whether it be, you know, in business or whether it be in sports, the people looking to perform at the highest level are going to tend to have a pretty high risk tolerance, and they're, you know, extremely driven towards, you know, achieving this thing, which means sort of by any means necessary. So the really, you know, drug use ends up being pretty pervasive because of that high risk tolerance, because of just that drive to, you know, do whatever needs to be done to achieve the goal. So that can take a lot of different forms. That can take the form of, you know, time investment, monetary investment, right? Like in the United States, we're not like funding our Olympic athletes on like a national level where our government is paying for them. So a lot of them, you know, are, you know, broke essentially, right? Like unless you're at the very highest level. So it's not just a health risk that you take, but it's, you know, a monetary investment, a time, you know, investment. And once you realize that, it starts to give context to this whole conversation of just like, basically the question is like, you know, what are you willing to risk? Like, what are you willing to give up? What price are you willing to pay? And then understanding very specifically what goal are we trying to achieve, and then matching the specific tool to the specific goal and the specific person with their risk tolerance and the, you know, contraindications that they're coming in. So, you know, that gives you sort of a little, you know, preamble here to understand like, oh, these are things that like I'm already kind of, you know, familiar with from other realms, in terms of just understanding risk, in terms of understanding like applying a very specific tool to a very specific problem, in terms of understanding the specificity of things, where it's like, you know, if I was training a swimmer, you know, picking exercises for a swimmer probably looks very different than, you know, an offensive lineman. Like their training probably looks very different. Well, guess what? Their drugs look very different too. And that doesn't mean that they're never going to be doing the same exercise. They may actually have some crossover there. And you could be like, well, why is this swimmer taking testosterone and this bodybuilder is taking testosterone and they look totally different? You know, so there's some overlap there. But the more you understand, like, oh, you know, maybe that testosterone is sort of like that bench press we were talking about earlier. Like it covers, you know, a wide number of things, but it maybe doesn't have a whole lot of specificity. And they start to look very similar, where it's like, oh, if we, you know, have a really specific tool to apply, even in the world of, you know, AAS, for steroids, um, probably the less learned, the less sort of mature and studied person might just use the same tool over and over again and use more of it because it covers like a really wide swath of things. And it's just like, well, if I just use more testosterone, it kind of does everything. And like, I'll probably hit the mark if I just, again, throw the grenade at it. Whereas we could be more specific and be like, well, again, kind of like, blowing up my wall over here, the testosterone also causes this problem and that problem. And like, can you tolerate that? Do you want that? For one sport, the thing that we call a problem is actually an advantage for another one. So in bodybuilding, having really thick blood, for the most part, up to, a pretty low threshold is not a huge benefit. But if I had to like cycle up the side of a mountain, huge benefit as far as oxygen delivery. So one person's, side effect is another person's, benefit or effect that they're looking for. So again, kind of long introduction here, but we'll get more specific to like what we're talking about. I'm assuming in this case, you don't have like a very, like what you gave me so far is like the person's age. You gave me like they want to get more muscular, and you said, they don't have any contraindications. There's no health issues that they have. And I'm assuming this is sort of just like a very broad archetype, not like a specific person you have in mind. Is that right?
Yeah. So yeah, let's just say the individual was interested in going down this hole, I want to say, um, and just basically doesn't have any idea, or just looking for like the proper guidance, um, and what would be like the smartest route,
Yeah. So
right?
like,
Well, no, go ahead, finish. That was it. That was it.
so like anything else, it follows the same principles. If you wanted to learn about, the biomechanics of exercise, like, how would you go about that? If you said, I want to start weight training, you say, I want to start, plumbing. I want to start, learning to brew coffee. Whatever it is, like they would all follow the same path. Some things you might do in that instance would be to like, seek out someone you perceive to be an expert in that area. The person who was like the biggest mentor to me was a guy named Broderick Chavez. And that's, someone who some of these concepts that I'll speak about, in this answer will probably come directly from some of the things I've learned from him throughout the years. So I want to give him credit. And he's got a membership site, and on that membership site, there's a place that says "Start Here," and what it is basically walks you through this exact question, which is like, okay, I want to start drugs. Like, what are some things I need to think about? And the very first things you need to think about have nothing to do with what drugs you're going to take. It really has more to do with understanding sort of the like, ethical, financial, time, again, as we get more specific to what you're taking, the health consequences, but the social consequences, right? So the very first step in all of this is actually not drug specific. And there is actually a pretty long, road to go down to really understand like if this, choice makes sense for you, and like how, like where you want to jump in with this whole thing. So we won't, if you want to sort of learn more about that, definitely encourage people to check out his site. But I would just first keep that in mind, without giving, an hour talk on, the social consequences, the financial consequences. I would just, say very broadly, like if your goal, and I know this isn't the person you're describing, but to give a little context, like if your goal is to be, the very best bodybuilder you can be, meaning like regardless of the outcome, you want to do everything you can do to maximize, your physique. It's much harder doing that with drugs than it is without drugs. Like it is easier to get to the same point in muscularity. You could put in, less effort take steroids and get to the same place faster than you could without them. But if your goal is to just be the best version that you can possibly be, it's much harder to do that with drugs. Like, you will get much further, but there will also be a lot more to manage in that process. And I don't think people fully give credence to actually how much goes into managing that. Just listing off a few things like rapid fire here, because there's greater health consequences, that also means like regular blood testing. That also means like having people in your corner that can interpret that and that can fix those problems when they come along. That means, being able to source all of these things, not just, the PEDs by themselves, but little things you never thought of, like, you're getting a blood pressure cuff, maybe a glucose monitor, like you're taking supplements that you weren't taking before. So the financial cost goes way up. The legal risks go way up. The time cost and investment of just like, not only, taking the drugs, but also now you are a bigger person. That means more food. That means greater fatigue as you're growing faster. That's physical fatigue, that's mental fatigue, that affects your work, right? So the consequences are so vast in making that decision, if you're trying to, do it at a high level and not just like say, I just want to, kind of dabble in this thing, which I know is probably closer to the person you're talking about. But keep in mind, just like the example before, like when you dabble, when you choose to not educate yourself and you choose to say, you know what, I'm just going to throw the grenade, you are also accepting the consequences that all those lifters in your gym did when they said, you know what, like, I don't really want to think too much about my training. Like, this is just like something I want to do on the side. Great. But in 20 years, when you didn't educate yourself, you didn't have, a good mentor, trainer, like you ignored, those symptoms, you didn't have, the right people to go to, you didn't, make assessments and measure things along the way, you will have unexpected consequences that maybe you didn't even realize were consequences. Same thing, right? So you can choose to take that path and say, well, I don't want to look like that guy. I just want a little bit of what he has. You don't get to just like forego the consequences, for this either. So there definitely is a lot of considerations to take in terms of like making that sort of, investment, from many different angles. So now, like, getting down to the specifics, and just in regards to time today, I think we'll try to narrow down the category of performance enhancing drugs specifically into anabolic steroids, which again is actually a very narrow, distinction. Like it is a small category of the entire subject that is performance enhancing drugs. But I think, just for the interest of people listening to this podcast, that's what they think of when they hear performance enhancing drugs. So that's kind of like what we'll stick to today is the anabolic steroids portion. So I think, again, much like with training, you want to identify, what we'll call like limiters or, contraindications, like what are we trying to avoid? I think that oftentimes is the best question to answer. I know, like, when I look at a menu at a restaurant, I often find it easier to be like, these are the things that I don't want. And you kind of hone in on, like, from there, okay, these are the 5 things that I might have. And I'm sure not, I'm sure there are some people who can resonate with that idea, but sometimes it's easier to just kind of quickly narrow down, like, okay, I'm not having breakfast. I'm not going to look at the dessert menu right now.
Absolutely.
Like, pizza. Okay, like I've honed in that I'm probably either going to have like a burger or, fried chicken, whatever, right? And then you're like, from there, you're like, the temperature in the room and what I had yesterday, and like you just converge, right? So it's the same process here of just like converging on something very specific, depending on, if you go to the Cheesecake Factory and you have like, a menu like a dictionary, versus, going somewhere where, I don't know, like Shake Shack or something, where like you're getting a burger and it's just like, you want cheese, no cheese, two patties or one patty. Like, I think most of us kind of prefer that in a lot of ways.
Oh yeah,
So that's kind of what you're dealing with here, is like, we'll take the cheesecake menu and we'll eliminate, all the other PEDs, and we'll just move to the burger section, which is like, anabolic steroids. And then from there,
perfect.
you still have like a lot of different decisions to make. It's like, okay, you're allergic to, pickles. So we definitely can't do pickles. And like, you're lactose intolerant. So like, you could do cheese, like, especially if you had like a lactase pill, but like, there might be some consequences to it, whether or not you're willing to deal with like those consequences. In this case, like, gas, right? If you're familiar with lactose intolerance. But you have to decide like, what, this one's a little more expensive than that one, this one's going to make me full, whatever, right? There's shit to consider. So I think one of the initial things to, consider here is permanence of like, if we're talking about someone who just like wants to dabble, which is going to be like the typical archetype of this person, where they're like, I'm not sure if this is like a commitment I want to make for the rest of my life. Like, I don't want to be a pro bodybuilder. Like, this may be a one-off thing. It may be something that I do on and off for years. Like, I don't know if I want to commit to taking a shot every week for the rest of my life. Even if you think you do, it's good. You're just like, all right, I got a job in like a new city. And it's like, am I going to just outright buy a new house and like be committed to that? Or am I going to like rent an apartment and kind of like get a feel for the area first? So I would say in general, like, it's probably wise to go with the like, let's just rent an apartment and like see how you do with this new city. So the example here of like renting an apartment would be going with something that's like shorter acting and that doesn't have as much of an effect on your endogenous or natural production of testosterone. So you could be a person that, already has low testosterone, right? Like I said, there's a lot of steps that we need to take before we start discussing actually taking drugs. But if, someone's, watched the videos on Broderick's site, for example, or someone else, and has an understanding of like, what are the prerequisites, you've already done your blood work and you already understand like, you know your family history, and you already understand like, oh, maybe, my lipids are a little bit skewed, but my liver enzymes are good, and my blood glucose regulation, is good, kidneys are good, what have you. But I have a family history of heart disease and I have a skewed lipid panel. All right, we're starting to create a picture of like where your potential weak points are. In this case, when it just comes specifically to testosterone, we might want to know ahead of time, like, is this someone whose natural production is already weaned off, or is this someone who's coming in with a high level of natural production? That could be an acute thing. It could be a young person who's just been through a really stressful period, be it like, a phase of dieting, contest prep, like, a move, break up with the girlfriend. Like, they may have just gone through some acute stressful period where their hormone levels are temporarily skewed. Or it might be this guy, that's, in his mid 40s, who's just kind of had a shitty lifestyle for the last like, 30 years, and they're probably not going to get back to normal testosterone levels. So those are two distinct people. And if someone's already coming in with low testosterone and that's why they're making this switch, they might automatically go to like a testosterone replacement dose. And that might be their very first inroad into this whole thing. So they go to their doctor, they find out they have low testosterone, and maybe their first, course or quote unquote cycle is, just a testosterone replacement therapy. And they get a feel for like, there's going to be a medical dose that they take, which is usually somewhere around 1 milligram per kilogram. Let's call it 100 milligrams a week of a long acting drug. So you take it once a week or once every 2 weeks. And that's something that could be medically supervised. So that may very well be like the first course of your like 45-year-old low testosterone guy. And then he's going to find out, what problems do I run into? Does it accelerate, my balding? Does it give me acne? Does, do I get estrogen side effects where maybe there's, some sensitivity of the nipple or some growth, in that area? And you will immediately get to, not immediately, but you will get to see with that course, like, even at a lower dose, what sort of issues might you run into, at the most baseline dose. Now, let's say the other example where someone doesn't have low testosterone and they want to dabble. Now we might want to ask, like, look, you might think you want to do this forever, or maybe you don't, but either way, like, let's go with the rent the apartment scenario and at least give you the option, to make it a little easier for you to shift courses after this. And what we would do in that scenario is we'd use something, short acting, like an oral drug. And, we would do that for a shorter time period. So something maybe in like the, 6 to 8 week kind of range, let's call it 8 on average, maybe as long as, 10 to 12, but something that's not testosterone, or not like a direct cousin of testosterone, that you could take for a shorter course, a shorter like block of time than you would say for maybe a more like advanced. And by advanced I just mean someone who's been taking drugs for a long time. This might be a shorter course with a shorter acting drug that's very dissimilar to testosterone, or as dissimilar as you're going to get within the like family of anabolic steroids. And the reason for that is when they come off, it'll be easiest to regain their natural levels. So they might decide based on circumstances, in their life, social circumstances, relationships, monetary, like just, they ran into too many side effects. This happens all the time, where it's like, someone tries their first course and for whatever reason, they don't want to do it again. Well, you don't want to be in a position where it's really hard to regain, your natural testosterone levels. So examples of like, these oral drugs that you've heard of before could be, an Anavar, a Winstrol, for example. These are coming in tablets ranging from, 2.5 milligrams all the way up to, 50 milligrams. And then, we might ask like, well, what type of dosing scheme would we use for something like that? And, for the testosterone I mentioned, there is medically prescribed dosing as a replacement therapy, which typically is, up to about 1 milligram per kilogram. It's not uncommon now in like these men's health TRT clinics to go as high as like, 2+ milligrams per kilogram. So it's not uncommon for people to be like 100 to 200 milligrams, a week to every 2 weeks, of testosterone nowadays in like a TRT clinic. And not too dissimilar as far as like, an oral steroid for someone like, on their first course. And the reason is, and this is per week, and the reason is because you're already going to have natural levels of testosterone. So when you add, an oral on top of that, at least for some, short period of time, let's, call it in that like 6 week range or so, like you're going to have declining, but much slower declining levels, if you take something that's, not testosterone, not directly related to it. And then when you come off, there's a quick cessation. It's not in your system, for a long time, like most injectable drugs would be. Also, there's the benefit of not having to like stick a needle in yourself, which, is more things that you have to source, needles, wipes, another, like loading pin on top of it. There are things that you need to understand then about like how to make that sanitary, technique, right? There's a lot more to think about with an injection than there is, an oral drug. So if we said, all right, it's, 100 milligrams a week, just to, ballpark a number, and we said, all right, we, divide that by 7 days. Now you're looking at something maybe in that like 15 milligram to 30 milligram if we were talking about, 100, 200 milligrams a week range. So let's call it like, 10 to 30 milligrams a week, which, it got there in a very dissimilar way to, I think, like how Broderick describes it. But I think that's very similar to like what his recommendation is kind of like an escalating dose, much like you would with training, where it's like, if in the beginning of a training block, you do X amount of sets, by the end of it, you might do X plus however many sets. So the idea that like you could have sort of an ascending level of stimulus so that you're getting a little bit, a little bit higher dose, each week versus just going right in at like, a peak dose. And the idea is that would be a little bit more efficient, both like from a training perspective and from, dosing perspective. But again, that gets, a little bit more nuanced. You could probably get away with just kind of like, a flat dose across time, but maybe something escalating, over that period from 10 to 20 to 30 milligrams is going to be relatively low risk, relatively reversible, relatively easy to source and expensive. And, that could be one example of how someone might go about, a first course and kind of like, dip their toes in the water where they would see effects. They could get an idea of like, what it was like to be enhanced without, putting themselves in a position for a tremendous amount of risk or irreversibility.
The reason that I love that answer is because anyone that would have done the stupid thing would have been like, fuck this is way too complicated. And anyone that would have listened to the whole shtick would come out of it with an intelligent approach. You know what I mean? So like in and of itself, that response was sort of selecting of a particular audience of people. So I think that would be helpful to anyone that has that question as well, for sure.
Yeah, I think that was great. I think that was great. There's a bunch of like on YouTube, for example, you'll see just information that floats around. Bunch of irresponsible information, I want to say, by just jacked individuals that, promote, X, Y, Z, with just like no real reference, I want to say, just like, from just things that they use in particular or, things they like. So I think that like clip, if you can like cut that somehow and use thumbnails for that, and just like have the right words, will be so fucking helpful for anyone who just like searches like you know that kind of like beginner steroids or whatever it is, and just like almost like he put out the disclaimer first, was just like, hey, before we get it into any kind of drugs, you need to know X, Y, and Z. Um, it's like one of those things where it's like I'm gonna try to talk you out of doing it, right? And then if it's really for you, then you'll continue to like pursue it. Um, but yeah, I think that was great for. I think most people should listen to that if they're interested in getting into it for no like specific reasons, if they're just general. So that was great, Ethan.
Yeah, and I think that a big takeaway that I have, that I have from that, and just other thing, just in terms of like learning, these types of things and more general principles from Ethan, more broadly, is just like trying to trying to ask maybe a more appropriate question, at every level, right? So rather than the person asking, I'm interested in this thing, how much should I take? The question might be any number of other things like, well, what's the goal or what's the motivation for wanting to? And if you are confident that, you have answers to those questions and you are confident that you want to move forward, then the first question shouldn't be, how much should I take? But, what can I do to learn more about this? Or what can I do to actually understand the process so that, although I rely on these other people that know more than I do, can I get to a point where I at least have an idea of like what I'm doing, to myself and what the potential outcomes could be, because I feel like much with exercise, people end up not taking it very seriously. And when you don't take it seriously and you don't invest any time into, any degree of education, not only are you not aware of the potential outcomes, good or bad, depending on how you look at them, but you don't have an ability to actually respond to things that happen to you, good or bad. So if good things are maybe happening for you, those good things eventually maybe become bad. Or if bad things are happening to you and you're struggling to understand maybe why they're happening, they eventually become good. So I just think that, like, with this topic in particular, like you said, Hector, there is so much information or misinformation, whatever you want to call it, and it is treated so casually. And I definitely have seen, firsthand people kind of not taking it seriously. So I definitely do hope that is something that can be talked about a little bit more openly in bodybuilders or in the bodybuilding space, in a way that is intelligent, because even the guys that are sort of at the top that are talking about it more transparently, it's not as if they're really able to explain the why and the how. Not that they necessarily need to, but I think that it should definitely be a topic that's broached at a higher at a higher level.
In some, go to modernmeathead.com. We're selling Anavar in
I have to cut that part out. Yeah.
110 milligram tablets. That'll get you 7 weeks at 20 milligrams a day, 10 milligrams in the morning, 10 milligrams at night. You'd be on your way.
See, for people watching, like, they'll see you smiling, but just to clarify, that was in fact a joke.
I do feel outside of the respective like sports of like bodybuilding and maybe others that require performance enhancement drugs, like people are just very curious because they just what they see, right? What they see of just like their gym heroes or like people they admire, and just like the information just gets thrown around very nonchalantly. And I do think there's not many sources that are in arm's reach, right? To kind of like go to and just like get some answers maybe that can help you identify whether you should do this or like maybe how you should think about it. So like everything that Ethan started with, right? Like if you were interested, it just has you thinking for a while. So maybe you're like, all right, I was interested in this. Now that I know this, I'm gonna sit back and think about this information a little bit, right? And if it settles with me correctly, if I feel like, all right, I'm ready to take the next step, then you kind of like pursue it in the manner he said. But I think there's just not many go-to places where you can like get good information. So yeah, I just thought that was great.
Yeah, and so just to quickly summarize, so 5 grams a day, creatine, monohydrates, 5,000 IU, vitamin D3, maybe some magnesium, glycinate thrown in there. Call it a day. That's pretty reliable, right? Don't you think? hard to go wrong with that stack, bro. And then maybe some sparkling water. This is actually watermelon lemonade flavor. Wow. Okay, nice. You got the Waterloo. Yeah. Hector, anything?
Damn, I don't have anything around me.
You're slacking today, man.
It's in my fridge. It's in my fridge.
Both of you put me on to the sparkling water. I don't know which one of you had it first, but I'll we'll leave that a mystery. We'll leave that a mystery for now. Yeah, so anyway, that was a solid fucking 2 hours, or close to it. So I think that's a good starting place. Hector, maybe we do this again at some point in the future, loop back around, talk to you again, so we can cover more things if you so choose.
Yeah, I definitely have some more questions. So we can definitely do this again.
All right. Ethan, anything to Anything to finish off with?
Oh, it was solid, man. It was a lot of fun today.
All right, perfect. All right, thanks, Heck.
All right, guys. Later.